On September 12th, 1944, in a military transport crossing the English Channel, Soviet Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov clutched a waterproof pouch containing intelligence reports that seemed impossible. The numbers described British industrial output that defied everything Soviet propaganda had taught him about the decaying capitalist West. Britain, supposedly on the verge of collapse, was producing more aircraft engines in a single month than the entire Soviet aviation industry managed in a year. To the political officers in Moscow, this would be dismissed as Western disinformation. But to the technical specialists who had seen the evidence firsthand, it was a terrifying revelation. It was the moment they realized the Cold War might already be lost before it began. This is the story of how Soviet officers discovered the truth about Western industrial power, and how that knowledge was systematically suppressed by a regime that couldn't afford to believe it. In the complex machinery of Soviet military intelligence, Dmitry Volkov was an unusual asset. As a liaison officer attached to British forces under the Eastern Front cooperation agreements, he was a trained engineer from the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, who understood industrial capacity in ways most political officers could not. Unlike the ideologues who populated Stalin's inner circle, Volkov was a pragmatist who believed in numbers, production statistics, and material reality. His loyalty was to the Soviet Union, and his mission was to assess Allied industrial capabilities for post-war planning. His position gave him access to British factories, supply depots, and logistics operations that few Soviets ever witnessed. He was supposed to report on military cooperation. What he discovered would challenge everything the Soviet system claimed about itself. In early 1944, Soviet intelligence officers began filing reports that seemed to contradict fundamental Marxist-Leninist theory about capitalist decay. The information didn't arrive in dramatic revelations, but as a slow accumulation of impossible data points. A Soviet engineer visiting a Rolls-Royce factory reported production rates that seemed to have an extra zero. A naval attaché in Glasgow described shipyards building destroyers faster than Soviet yards could build submarines. A technical liaison at a radar facility sent encrypted messages about British electronics manufacturing that operated at scales unknown in the Soviet Union. Individually, these reports could be questioned. Together, they formed a pattern that terrified Moscow's strategic planners. They all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The capitalist West, supposedly dying from its internal contradictions, possessed industrial capacity that exceeded Soviet capabilities by margins too large to ignore. The British were applying mass production techniques and technological innovation at levels that made Soviet heavy industry look primitive by comparison. Volkov and his team compiled the evidence methodically. If British factories could produce 10,000 Merlin engines per month, a figure verified through multiple sources, that meant one engine every 4 minutes from facilities across the Midlands. Soviet factories, despite heroic worker efforts and 5-year plans, produced perhaps 2,000 comparable engines monthly across the entire Union. The mathematics were devastating. The production ratio was 5-to-1, and Britain was the smaller partner in the Western alliance. What must American capacity be? The intelligence was cross-referenced through diplomatic channels, defector testimonies, and captured German assessments. Even Nazi industrial planners, in documents seized during the Soviet advance, had calculated British production at levels Moscow found impossible to accept. The data was solid, the sources were reliable. But how could this be? How could a capitalist system, supposedly riddled with class conflict and market chaos, achieve industrial efficiency that exceeded Soviet central planning? How could workers motivated by profit rather than socialist duty outproduce Soviet laborers building the workers' paradise? In Marxist theory, capitalism was inherently inefficient, wasteful, prone to crisis. The evidence suggested something else entirely. It meant the ideological foundation of Soviet superiority might be built on false assumptions. It meant the coming confrontation with the West might not be the inevitable triumph Stalin predicted. As one intelligence analyst wrote in a classified memo later found in Soviet archives, if these British production figures represent even 70% of reality, then our post-war strategy requires complete revision. This is not ideological speculation. This is industrial mathematics, and the calculations are not favorable. 6,000 miles to the west, in the industrial heartland of Britain, the impossible was grinding out reality in factories that ran day and night. The Rolls-Royce facilities at Derby and Crewe represented something Soviet observers struggled to comprehend. These weren't just factories. They were industrial ecosystems that combined precision engineering with mass production at scales that seemed mutually exclusive. The main production halls stretched for hundreds of meters, assembly lines moving with mechanical precision that reduced engine construction from weeks to hours. Designed by British industrial efficiency experts who had studied both American mass production and British craft tradition, the facilities produced Merlin engines for Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes. Each engine contained over 8,000 precision components manufactured to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Soviet factories struggled to maintain such precision in small batch production. The British achieved it at industrial scale. The real revolution wasn't just the buildings or the machinery, it was the organizational philosophy. British engineers had solved a problem that bedeviled Soviet planners: how to maintain quality while maximizing quantity, how to combine the precision of skilled craftsmen with the efficiency of assembly lines, how to decentralize production without losing control. They deconstructed engine production into specialized subassemblies. Component manufacturers across Britain produced parts to exact specifications. Final assembly facilities integrated components with quality control at every stage. This distributed manufacturing network meant that bombing a single factory couldn't cripple production. New facilities could be brought online in months. The workforce itself contradicted Soviet assumptions about capitalist labor exploitation. Women operated precision machine tools. Skilled craftsmen worked alongside semi-skilled operators. Engineers collaborated with floor workers to solve production bottlenecks. Labor unions, far from disrupting production, helped streamline operations through worker input. This was supposed to be impossible under capitalism, where workers were exploited cogs in a machine. Yet productivity exceeded anything Soviet factories achieved, despite Stakhanovite campaigns and socialist competition. The facilities operated around the clock in 3 shifts, producing 10,000 Merlin engines monthly at peak output. Each shift change took minutes, the coordination seamless. Raw materials flowed in through one end. aluminum alloys, steel forgings, precision bearings. Finished engines emerged from the other, test run, inspected, ready for installation. The scale of supporting infrastructure astounded Soviet observers. The factories consumed electricity at rates that would black out Soviet industrial cities. Power flowed continuously from a national grid that Britain had built decades earlier. Machine tools, many imported from America or Sweden, operated with precision that Soviet equipment couldn't match. The quality control systems would have been called wasteful in Soviet terms. Engines that didn't meet specifications were torn down and rebuilt, not shipped anyway to meet quotas. This insistence on quality over quantity somehow produced both quality and quantity at levels Soviet industry couldn't approach. British workers, paid by capitalist bosses, produced more than Soviet workers building socialism. The Spitfire they powered flew circles around Soviet fighters, and this was just aircraft engines. Similar operations existed for tanks, ships, electronics, chemicals, every sector of industrial production. Soviet technical specialists who witnessed these operations understood the implications immediately. Major Pavel Lebedev, an aircraft engineer who visited Derby in early 1944, wrote in his confidential report, "I have reviewed British engine production with access to their facilities and documentation. The efficiency exceeds our capabilities by factors I hesitate to report, as the figures will not be believed. A single British factory complex produces more engines monthly than our entire aviation industry. The workers labor no harder than Soviet workers, but the organization, machinery, and technical sophistication create productivity we cannot match with current methods." Armed with devastating evidence of Western industrial superiority, Soviet intelligence officers faced an impossible challenge: how to report these findings to a regime where questioning Soviet supremacy could mean death. The wall of ideological rigidity surrounding Stalin made honest strategic assessment nearly impossible. The chief architect of Soviet delusion wasn't Stalin alone, but the entire apparatus of political commissars, party ideologists, and NKVD enforcers who had built careers on proclaiming Soviet superiority. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, despite his military brilliance, was a product of this system. When Volkov's initial reports reached military intelligence headquarters, they triggered not analysis, but suspicion. The numbers were wrong. Western propaganda had clearly deceived Soviet observers. No capitalist system could outproduce socialist industry. This wasn't just institutional inertia, it was ideological necessity. The entire Soviet system justified its existence, its sacrifices, its purges, its famines, through the promise of superior socialist productivity. To admit that capitalist Britain outproduced the Soviet Union was to question the revolution itself. When Volkov requested a meeting with senior military planners to present detailed evidence, the response was bureaucratic deflection. His reports were filed as interesting, but requiring verification. The verification process was assigned to political officers whose careers depended on finding fault with any suggestion of Western superiority. Volkov tried to present the specifics. The documented production figures verified through multiple sources. The photographic evidence of factory layouts and capabilities. The testimony of Soviet engineers who had witnessed operations firsthand. The analysis was dismissed. These capitalists inflate their numbers for propaganda purposes. Our spies are being deceived by staged demonstrations. True socialist production, disciplined and planned, must exceed the chaos of capitalist markets. This wasn't just one official's opinion. It was the mandatory interpretation. For Soviet planners to accept Volkov's analysis would require admitting several devastating truths. Soviet 5-year plans had failed to achieve their proclaimed industrial miracles. Soviet workers, despite propaganda about superior motivation, were less productive than capitalist workers. Soviet technology lagged behind Western innovations. Soviet organization, despite central planning, was less efficient than market-driven capitalism. These admissions were impossible. They would invalidate the entire Soviet project. Better to reject the evidence than face such conclusions. Plus, accepting Volkov's intelligence would require complete revision of post-war strategy. Stalin's plans for Eastern European domination, assumed Soviet industrial superiority, would overwhelm Western economic pressure. If the West actually outproduced the Soviet Union by significant margins, confrontation would be catastrophic. The alternative, accommodation with capitalism, was ideologically unthinkable. And so the reports went nowhere. They were classified at levels that prevented circulation. The analysts who produced them were reassigned to less sensitive positions. The wall of denial stood firm, reinforced by decades of ideological conditioning and the very real threat of punishment for ideological deviation. Presenting uncomfortable facts in Stalin's Soviet Union was more than professionally risky. It was potentially fatal. Whether at the Kremlin or the offices of military intelligence, the atmosphere was paranoid and unforgiving. Strategic reality was whatever Stalin declared it to be. Military briefings were performances designed to confirm predetermined conclusions rather than assess actual conditions. Into this environment, evidence of Western industrial superiority was political dynamite. Stalin's view of the capitalist West was shaped by Marxist-Leninist theory, as interpreted through decades of propaganda. Capitalism was in its final crisis stage, kept alive only through imperialist exploitation and war profiteering. When confronted with production figures showing British industrial output exceeding Soviet capacity, figures documented by his own intelligence services, Stalin's reaction was predictable and dangerous. The data was wrong. Intelligence had been compromised. Western agents had planted disinformation. These numbers were designed to demoralize Soviet planning and were therefore proof of hostile intent. This wasn't just strategy. It was personal validation of his worldview. The numbers contradicted Marxist theory, therefore the numbers were false. The alternative, that his understanding of economics was flawed, was psychologically impossible for a dictator who had built his power on ideological certainty. Foreign Commissar Molotov, one of the few men who could speak semi-candidly with Stalin, later admitted in interviews that any suggestion of Western industrial superiority in the 1,940 seconds would have been seen as defeatism, bordering on treason. Stalin believed Soviet sacrifices during the war proved socialist superiority, that the Soviet Union had broken the Wehrmacht, demonstrated the power of planned economy and revolutionary spirit, that this victory had been achieved with enormous Western material aid, millions of tons of supplies delivered through Lend-Lease, was minimized in official history. To acknowledge the scale of Western assistance was to admit dependence on capitalism, an ideological impossibility. So the great confrontation with reality never occurred. Intelligence reports were filtered through political commissars who removed inconvenient data. Production comparisons were manipulated to show Soviet achievements in favorable light. Technology gaps were attributed to temporary wartime disruptions rather than systemic problems. The fundamental question, whether Soviet industrial organization could compete with Western capitalism, was never honestly examined because the answer was predetermined by ideology. Stalin's worldview allowed no space for the possibility that capitalism, in its death throes, could outproduce the socialist future. Several intelligence officers who had pressed too hard for honest assessment of Western capabilities were quietly arrested in 1945 and 1946. Charged with spreading defeatist propaganda or contact with foreign agents, they disappeared into the Gulag system. The message was clear. Truth was whatever served the party. Reality was what Stalin said it was. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, Soviet post-war strategy was built on foundations of deliberate ignorance. The consequences of that denial became apparent as the Cold War crystallized in the late 1940s. Believing Soviet industrial superiority was fact rather than fiction, Stalin made strategic decisions that would haunt Soviet planning for decades. Soviet military doctrine continued, emphasizing mass production of standardized equipment, assuming quantity could overwhelm Western quality. Resources poured into heavy industry while consumer goods remained scarce, the sacrifice justified by claims of building industrial capacity superior to the West. When the Marshall Plan began rebuilding Western Europe in 1947, Soviet analysts who warned it would create an economic bloc beyond Soviet capacity to challenge were dismissed. The capitalist economies would inevitably collapse. Crisis was just delayed by American money. They didn't have time to adjust their assumptions because reality was about to demonstrate its mathematical certainty. Throughout the late 1940s, intelligence that should have reshaped Soviet strategy was systematically ignored. American industrial output, even after war production scaled back, exceeded Soviet capacity by margins that made confrontation dangerous. The British, despite post-war austerity, maintained technological advantages in jet engines, radar, and electronics. Western Europe's economic recovery, far from collapsing as Marxist theory predicted, accelerated beyond pre-war levels. The gap was widening, not closing. In 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, Stalin proclaimed, "This proved socialist science had surpassed capitalism." Soviet propaganda celebrated, but technical specialists knew the truth. The bomb's design was based on stolen American plans. Soviet physics hadn't caught up to Western science. They had simply copied it successfully. In 1950, the Korean War provided brutal empirical testing of Soviet versus Western industrial capacity. Soviet-equipped North Korean forces, supplied with tanks, aircraft, and artillery from Soviet factories, faced American and Allied forces supplied from Western industry. The initial North Korean advantages, achieved through surprise and Soviet material support, evaporated as American production ramped up. Within months, the material imbalance became overwhelming. American forces deployed equipment in quantities that Soviet logistics couldn't match. The technological gap in aircraft, electronics, and precision weapons demonstrated Western superiority that Soviet numbers couldn't overcome. Soviet observers watching from China and North Korea sent reports confirming what Volkov had tried to explain in 1944. Western industrial capacity exceeded Soviet capabilities across virtually every category. The American B-29 bombers devastating North Korean cities were products of the same industrial system Volkov had warned about. The Americans were fighting a limited war on the other side of the world while maintaining forces in Europe and continuing to outproduce Soviet industry. This should have been impossible according to Soviet economic theory. Yet it was happening. Military analysts who tried to brief Soviet leadership on these disparities found themselves sidelined. The problems were temporary. Soviet industry would catch up. Quality of soldiers and revolutionary spirit mattered more than material advantage. These reassurances couldn't change mathematics. By 1953, when Stalin died, the production gap between Soviet and Western industry was enormous and growing. The West had built an integrated industrial economy that exceeded Soviet capacity across almost every measure. The denial of this reality, the refusal to honestly assess Western capabilities, had locked Soviet strategy into confrontation. It couldn't win economically. The spies had been right. The analysts had been correct. September 1944 was when a critical truth reached Moscow, documented and verified, and the system was too rigid, too ideologically constrained to act on it. For Dmitry Volkov, the price of reporting uncomfortable truths was steep, but survivable. Barely. His detailed assessments of British industrial capacity, rather than earning commendation, marked him as politically unreliable. In the paranoid atmosphere of late Stalinist Soviet Union, competence that contradicted official narratives looked suspicious. After returning to the Soviet Union in 1945, Volkov found his career trajectory stalled. Promotions went to officers who confirmed what leadership wanted to hear. His technical expertise was valuable enough to prevent outright arrest, but his frank assessments made him dangerous. He was reassigned from strategic intelligence to administrative positions where his analysis wouldn't challenge policy. His security clearance was quietly downgraded. Access to sensitive information was restricted. He was being marginalized, pushed away from positions where his inconvenient competence might cause problems. Several of his colleagues who had filed similar reports weren't as fortunate. 3 intelligence officers who had accompanied him on British factory visits were arrested in 1946, charged with exaggerating Western capabilities to spread defeatism. 2 died in labor camps. 1 survived to be rehabilitated after Stalin's death. Volkov understood he had narrowly escaped the same fate. His survival depended on silence. In 1950, Volkov was offered early retirement from military intelligence. The offer was presented as recognition of his service, but the subtext was clear. Accept retirement or risk reassignment to positions where political reliability mattered more than technical competence. He took the retirement package. At 43 years old, one of the Soviet Union's most perceptive industrial analysts was pushed out of intelligence work. He found employment as an engineering instructor at a technical institute in Sverdlovsk, teaching industrial mechanics to students who would never know their professor had seen the future of Soviet Western competition and tried to warn the system that refused to listen. His detailed reports, his meticulous documentation of Western industrial capacity, remained classified in Soviet military archives. They would stay buried for decades, unknown to historians, and suppressed from Soviet strategic planning. He lived quietly in Sverdlovsk, largely forgotten by the intelligence establishment he had served. Former colleagues stopped corresponding. Association with a politically questionable figure was dangerous. He was effectively erased from Soviet intelligence history while still alive. When he died in 1978 of cancer, his obituary in the local Sverdlovsk newspaper was brief and mentioned only his work as an engineering instructor. His intelligence service was classified and couldn't be acknowledged. His warnings about Western industrial superiority, warnings that might have reshaped Soviet strategy if heeded, died with him, forgotten. His classified files were finally opened to researchers in 1991 as the Soviet Union collapsed. Historians examining the documents were stunned by their accuracy and prescience. Everything was there. The production comparisons that seemed impossible had been conservative. The strategic analysis had been remarkably foresighted. The warnings about Soviet inability to match Western industrial output had been specific and actionable. An intelligence officer had seen the economic contradictions that would eventually collapse the Soviet system. And for his clarity, he had been silenced and erased. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991 and archives opened to researchers, the full scope of what Volkov and others had reported became undeniable. The numbers weren't exaggerated. They had been underestimates. British industrial production during World War II had exceeded Soviet output in multiple critical categories, despite Britain's smaller population and territory. At peak production in 1944, Britain produced over 10,000 Merlin engines monthly. Soviet engine production never exceeded 3,000 comparable units monthly throughout the war. British aircraft production totaled over 130,000 military aircraft, from 1,939 to 1,945. Soviet production was larger at 157,000, but required a population 3 times Britain's size and achieved lower quality standards. The productivity per worker, the metric that mattered for post-war competition, showed British workers outproducing Soviet workers by ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. Think about those implications. Britain, the smaller ally, achieved productivity levels that Soviet central planning couldn't match, even with unlimited coercion and sacrifice. American production, the true colossus of Western industry, exceeded Soviet capacity by margins so large that direct competition was fantasy. From 1,940 to 1,945, the United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Soviet production was 157,000. The U.S. built 88,000 tanks. The Soviets built 105,000. But Soviet tanks were simpler designs produced with lower quality standards. In ships, electronics, vehicles, and almost every category of military production, American output exceeded Soviet capacity by factors of 2 to 5. The economist Wassily Leontiev, analyzing declassified production data in 1995, concluded that Soviet industrial productivity in 1945 was approximately 30% of American levels. This gap never closed. Soviet 5-year plans claimed miraculous growth, but actual productivity remained far below Western standards throughout the Cold War. The Soviet economic system, vaunted for its planning efficiency, was actually extraordinarily wasteful. Resources were misallocated. Production quotas encouraged quantity over quality. Technological innovation was stifled by bureaucracy, and worker productivity remained low, despite propaganda about socialist labor enthusiasm. The Western market economies that Soviet theory predicted would collapse instead thrived. Marshall Plan aid rebuilt Western Europe into an economic bloc that exceeded Soviet GDP by the 1,960 seconds. American productivity continued growing, creating middle-class prosperity that Soviet citizens could only imagine. The Asian tigers, capitalist economies like Japan and South Korea, achieved growth rates that made Soviet performance look stagnant. The failure to honestly assess Western capabilities in the 1,940 seconds had locked Soviet strategy into an economic competition it couldn't win. Every escalation of the Cold War, from the arms race to the space program to support for global communist movements, strained Soviet resources beyond sustainable limits. Soviet leaders from Khrushchev onward knew the truth that Stalin had refused to accept. The Soviet economy couldn't match Western productivity. Competition with the West was bleeding the Soviet Union economically. The entire confrontational posture of Soviet foreign policy was built on industrial capacity that didn't exist. By the 1,980 seconds, even Soviet leadership acknowledged the system was failing. Gorbachev's reforms were tacit admission that Soviet economic organization couldn't compete with Western capitalism. The opening of Soviet archives in 1991 revealed something historians found remarkable. Soviet intelligence had accurately assessed Western capabilities from the 1,940 seconds onward. The information was there. The analysis was correct. The warnings had been delivered by professionals like Volkov, who understood what they were seeing. But the political system couldn't process information that contradicted ideological certainty. Intelligence was suppressed when it challenged Marxist theory. Analysts were punished for reporting facts that suggested capitalism wasn't collapsing. Strategy was built on wishful thinking rather than honest assessment. The Soviet Union wasn't defeated because it lacked information. It was defeated because its ideology prevented it from accepting what its own intelligence services reported. They built strategy on assumptions contradicted by their own data. And when reality finally overwhelmed propaganda, the entire system collapsed. The spies were right. The analysts were correct. September 1944 was when critical truth about Western industrial superiority reached Soviet leadership with documentation and verification. And nobody with power was willing to acknowledge it. This story demonstrates that historical outcomes often turn on institutional capacity to process uncomfortable information. Whether governments can distinguish between what they want to believe and what is actually true, in the end, the story of Soviet intelligence on Western industrial capacity isn't just Cold War history. It's a permanent lesson about ideological blindness and its consequences. The Soviet system wasn't defeated by lack of information. It was crippled by systematic refusal to believe information that contradicted official ideology. Soviet leaders wanted to believe Marxist theory proved socialism's inevitable superiority over capitalism. The data said capitalism was more productive. Rather than adapt theory to reality, they rejected reality. They built 70 years of strategy on ideological assumptions that their own intelligence proved false. And when economic mathematics finally overwhelmed propaganda, the entire structure collapsed. The conflict between Volkov's documented reports and the ideological rigidity of Soviet leadership was a battle for institutional honesty. Evidence versus ideology, strategic reality versus comfortable theory. In the 1,940 seconds, ideology won decisively. And in winning that battle, it guaranteed losing the Cold War. Western industrial capacity, the productive power that Volkov had tried to warn about, proved unstoppable. Free market economies, for all their apparent chaos and inefficiency, organized resources more effectively than Soviet central planning. Democratic societies, supposedly weakened by class conflict, mobilized industrial capacity that command economies couldn't match. Technological innovation flourished in systems that allowed competition and rewarded creativity. The very aspects of Western society that Marxist theory identified as fatal weaknesses, market competition, political pluralism, economic freedom, turned out to be sources of strength that Soviet rigid planning couldn't overcome. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, it wasn't because Western military forces defeated it. Economic reality had done that decades earlier. Soviet leaders had known the truth since at least the 1,960 seconds, but couldn't admit it publicly without delegitimizing the entire Soviet project. So they maintained the facade, built weapons they couldn't afford, supported allies they couldn't sustain, and competed economically with nations vastly more productive until the whole structure collapsed from internal contradictions. And so the legacy of September 1944 echoes through history. It remains a stark reminder that the most dangerous enemy of any nation isn't external threats, but internal inability to face uncomfortable truths. Institutional systems that punish honesty and reward conformity eventually destroy themselves. Dmitry Volkov tried to deliver truth that could have reshaped Soviet strategy. He was silenced and forgotten. The industrial capacity he documented continued growing in the West, while Soviet productivity stagnated. And the superpower that refused to believe its own intelligence services collapsed 70 years after the revolution, defeated not by armies, but by economic mathematics it had denied from the beginning.